I think Ann Sadowski's traveling, isn't she? I think I saw that on Facebook. I thought of her this morning, and I'm going to share it with you. I remember going through a receiving line, or she came through the receiving line early on in my time here, and she said, you know, Ann, she's just incredible at sort of fashion and look and image and all that stuff. And she had said, "What's up with you? What's up with you? You're dressed in beige, your complexion's beige, your teeth are beige, even your hair is beige." And what I realized this morning when I got up and looked in the mirror is it's 10 years later and I'm gray. So share that with her. And I put this tie was specifically for her. I got my flash of color. It really is. It's wonderful to be back in Dallas again. I was able to come in a little bit early and spend some time around downtown and uptown, especially walking around and seeing all the developments that are down there. And I don't know how it happened, but somehow in the 6 years that I lived here, I always managed to avoid the Texas OU energy. All I heard about it was, oh, the crowds are crazy and there's just all this traffic, and it felt somewhat burdensome. And so somehow or other, it just wasn't a part of my experience while I was here. Well, we made plans with some friends to go to the state fair before we realized that this was Texas. So I got a full immersion experience yesterday. I know what that's about, and actually I love it. We ended up having a great time. We had made some plans ahead of time because we knew that traffic was going to be nuts. So we met down at Market Center and took the train in. And apparently at that point, the game had already started. So, there was no great crowd. There was no big crush. But coming back, the game had ended. And it was just a sea of orange and red and this crush that we sort of got pushed back toward where we're going to board the trains again. And they had trains lined up, and they run special routes for this particular event. And so nobody really quite understood what was happening. They had us crossing over and getting on the opposite side of the tracks, and it was this mad rush when the doors opened. So we were literally tighter than I've ever been in any situation at all. And the train started to move, and it was headed east, away from downtown. And so the question that came up for us, for most of us, was what's next? Which I think is an appropriate question. That's what I titled this talk. I didn't get there by train, but the talk was inspired as I began to think about, okay, Unity of Dallas has been going through a bunch of changes. I know they've had some really wonderful processes and have made some choices and decisions about how to move forward with property and with facilities, and they're in the middle of a ministerial choice. And so I imagine that what's on their minds, or what's in the consciousness of the community right now, is about what comes next. How is it that we're going to move into that from a deep spiritual place? And it's also a great question for all of us personally to be holding, because it's so easy to get swept up in the intellectualizing and in the reacting when we're facing the unknown, when we're not sure what's coming up next. It's helpful to be able to have a practice or a suggestion or a spiritual approach to make sure that the choices that we're making arise out of what we believe to be our highest and good, or what we know to be our highest and best. I'm not used to having a microphone there, so keep my hands down. So with Unity Dallas going through that kind of a questioning, I was able to sort of look at what was happening on this train with a different kind of frame, a different kind of perspective. Because initially, when the train starts headed the wrong way down the tracks, and we know downtown is that away, folks get anxious. What's next? Where are we going next? How are we going to get to where we need to be? And there's a level of anxiety about it. And for some people, it goes to, all right, trying to figure it out. We got to figure out where's the train going, where the next stop's going to be. I was looking at route maps. That was sort of my approach, because I kind of want to know where I am. And it was then after that sort of subsides, and because we were stopping and going, there were lots of trains, there was plenty of time. So the anxiety began to sort of subside. And some people would get angry about that. They had somewhere to be, and so their experience of that train ride wasn't particularly pleasant. And then for others, it became almost an adventure, They started to get to know the folks who were next to them in a way that you might otherwise not have. Where are you from, Unless they were, I guess it was kind of obvious if you were in a yellow or a red shirt. There was That maybe changed the conversation a little bit. But people began to connect in different ways, and it became a discovery rather than a burden. There was a different energy that's brought to it. And what I recognize is that all of those responses are a natural part of dealing with the unknown. They're a natural part of getting to what's next. And we step into those at different points in different places depending on the circumstance or the situation. But when we're questioning, it is even appropriate maybe that we allow ourselves those emotions that maybe at first seem like they're not spiritual enough. You know what I mean? So allow ourselves to be in the space of not knowing, allow ourselves to have that bit of anxiety, and just recognize that there's a process that we can move through. I did this really well at the first service. I'm going to try and reenact that part. So imagine I'm on that train. My initial reaction is somewhat frustration, right? I'm in this place where, see, often in Unity what happens is that we want to be at that spiritual place, right? We get on the train, we're crowded and we're cramped and we're hungry and tired and we're expecting to be somewhere else. That's a certain frame of mind that we're holding. And from that space, it might be kind of hard to be loving and accepting toward the screaming kid down at my feet. You know, that's rather a large leap. So there might be a process that's helpful to move through that, right? I might start with, okay, if I can just, I get that I'm in a place here that I'm not crazy about being. I would like to shift this energy. If I can just move one step over and maybe breathe into it and relax a little bit, and then begin to, okay, I have this anxiety. I need more information. What would help me in this moment to feel more comfortable? Oh, there's a route map right over my head here. Get the information. Okay, now I can be a little bit more calm about the situation I am in. Maybe I can begin to look around a little bit and start up the conversation with the person next to me. I've begun to transform that experience, but I didn't get there from frustrated to unconditional love in a single step. There's a process, an evolutionary process that we move through. I've been reading an amazing book by Imelda Shanklin. How many know Imelda? She's a long, old-school Unity teacher. In fact, this printing was the 6th printing in 1926. So we're probably talking about 100 years, wisdom from 100 years ago. And she comes in some ways out of that absolutist Unity perspective. You know, you claim truth, you live that truth, and there's no room for anything less than the divine in us. There's a little bit of that sort of thinking in here. But she also talks about one of the avenues through which we begin to step into that different way of being arises out of remembering the truth of who we are, remembering the essence of our very being, remembering that we arise out of an eternal God, that life indeed is eternal. There's an aspect of us that is always present, that is always a piece of that love, that is always available for a greater possibility of that embodiment of God. As we become aware of that and can remember that eternal peace, then we begin to move through that process in a different way. Right? We've got sort of the end story we're holding in mind, and we can allow the pieces to move forward. She talks about that in the framework of time. And I know the language is a little, in some ways, even stilted, but if you can let it sort of bubble through your consciousness, just see if it doesn't, I don't want to say trigger, that's the wrong word, inspire is a better word, doesn't inspire a different way to think about that eternal aspect of self. Eternity, she writes, underlies time. In it are cast our life and all that is true and good and lovely. No one wholly lives until we are conscious of our relation to eternity, until we withdraw our soul from the surface events that compose time and abide in the interior realities of beingness, endless being. Doesn't that just sort of instantly move you, into a space of, I don't know, almost like swing low, sweet chariot, sort of lifts us out of whatever the burden is, and we're able to connect at a whole different level of energy. And she talks about eternity being, there are 3 aspects of time in eternity. There's yesterday, there's today, and there's tomorrow. She writes, today is the age of creation. It associates with, the word that she used was phantasm. Am I pronouncing that correctly? P-H-A-N-T-S-A-M, phantasm, which I wanted to look up. I mean, fantasy sort of came to mind, but it's more about the forms. It's form that we're holding in mind. It's imagination if we're looking for 12 powers. And as we know, imagination can go both ways, right? I can imagine something as being wonderful and uplifting, or I can imagine something in that situation that I'm dreading. So it's a power, and it depends on our application of it. So today is the age of creation, where we can engage that power of fantasy, and we can either ground it in truth, or we can let the fantasy sort of run rampant in us. Tomorrow, she writes, is the age of fulfillment. In it, we shall have the act of today as either a help or a hindrance to the realization of eternity. So tomorrow is the aspect of sort of being willing to step into it. Tomorrow is the next. And the next is totally informed by where we are in the today. And she writes yesterday. The yesterday piece is wonderful too. Yesterday is the age of retrospect, when we measure what we did by what we had hoped. I like that way of thinking about, Unity. We don't believe in we have a different context for sin. Sin is sort of missing the mark. We all know that one. But what we had hoped is different than a sort of having to completely. I don't like where this is going. Can we erase about the last 3 sentences? Will you do that with me? We measure what we did by what we had hoped. So what we are imagining for yesterday's tomorrow is a space where we can begin to sort of gain direction and insight about how we move into the next tomorrow. Does that make sense? She writes, what we were as compared to yesterday's yesterday had dreamed. I like her. I think I need about another year of study to really feel like I can fully represent Imelda Shanklin. But I did want to share that piece with you, because I think it's in that threefold phase that yesterday, today, and tomorrow is the progression that we talk about here. It's sort of, we measure where we're headed, both by the wisdom of experience that we have and by the desire that's calling us forward. That's all a piece of how we move into that. And it's an evolution. It's a progression. It's something that we continue to live into. I have a short video that I would love to share with you, and I share it with this sort of invitation to think about it as an illustration of that progression, right? I can remember it's an illustration of sort of how the universe works, how the planets are interrelated and the cosmos and all that stuff. And I'd share it. How many remember, like in high school for me, I can remember the little model that sat on the teacher's desk with the sun in the middle and all these mechanical gears, and they'd sort of spin around. That was a framework. That was sort of a yesterday framework. This little clip video shows us sort of the next iteration, the next progression in moving toward what's coming, what's next. So let's watch. That's probably good, sort of get the point. So from the helical model of how planets spin to this vortex, and when I saw that, I know if there are astrophysicists in the room, I know that there are models that go beyond this, but for me that was like, the universe has this incredible capacity. And the one piece that I would kind of argue with, in the narrative down here, it said the old model was boring and incorrect. I don't think I would say that, because I believe there was still, the orbit was still happening. So it wasn't that it was necessarily incorrect, maybe not complete. We have and I'm using this for you because it's an integral approach, right? So what was is actually a part of what's being included in an evolution of what's yet to be. That's such a beautiful, and I know that, because I talked to someone who has more awareness about cosmological affairs than I do, I know that there are galaxies that are moving in ways that we're just beginning to understand and image that will also include and encompass this vortex piece. So that idea of what comes next, standing in the here and now and being able to look back at the old model that I believed and was taught, and also able to sort of look ahead at this new model of vortex and see that that is a progression that gives me a greater insight and awareness and excitement about what life is and what human capacity can bring forth, gives me the confidence and the trust in that process to understand that whatever we discover down the road, whatever is next, is also going to be a part of a greater good. Does that make sense? That sounds really theoretical, doesn't it? Okay, I'm going to bring it all back down now to something in a really practical, not quite as, well, yeah, about as practical as being on a crowded train. So last week, I live in Chicago. Many of you know Illinois has gone through financial crisis, or if you don't, the state's having a lot of trouble making enough money to pay its bills. And so they're coming up with lots of creative ways to make up that revenue split. One of those is these cameras at a whole bunch of intersections that catch people speeding, right? So I'm aware of that. I've heard about it, and in the mail came a lovely, one of those business letters that's a real, it's not fat, it's not a marketing thing, it's a one sheet, inside of it is a one sheet. And it's from the Chicago Department of Finance, Citation Division. So I'm amazed at how quickly, without knowing what was in the envelope, without having opened that envelope, I went to indignation and defensiveness, right? You know that feeling? When I opened the letter, it did in fact confirm that I had been clocked speeding and that a citation had been issued, but it had been issued improperly and so was being dismissed. So it actually became sort of a warning, right? There was no bad news in that for me. In fact, I kind of got away with something. And yet, the energy that I had invested in the story that I made up was a complete waste of time, right? That projection of what I thought was coming next was being shaped by a total fantasy, right? The same thing happens for us, and I wonder how often that happens for us, or how frequently it happens without us even recognizing or being aware of it, right? Every situation we face, every what's next in your life has that question around it, right? And we can shape that either by coming from that space of our eternality, coming from that space of wholeness, coming from that space of knowing that the universe is taking care of itself and there's this amazing capacity for good to express, no matter how it looks or how we feel about it, that we can begin to rest into more fully. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's go ahead, and I'm going to close this. I'd like to do a sort of a collective affirmation about the power of knowing that eternal nature of us. And it arises out of one that I'm sort of pirating from Charles, but I'm rewording him. I didn't reword Imelda, who is at least as old, but I'm rewording Charles a little bit. Except for this part. Poised in divine intelligence. Isn't that beautiful? Say that part with me. Poised in divine intelligence. My choices bring forth my highest good. Together, my choices bring forth my highest good. Okay, can we do the whole thing together without the break in between and me repeating it? Poised in divine intelligence, my choices bring forth my highest good. Okay, one more time, and this time maybe even close your eyes, and I want you to feel what it is to be poised in divine intelligence, to be poised in possibility, to be poised in the goodness of all that the universe encompasses and is. Okay, together. Poised in divine intelligence, my choices bring forth my highest good. And I know it to be true because you and I are divine creations, divine emanations of the Most High God. So it is, and thank you for allowing me to be with you again. It's been a blessing.